So this section, 4.6, is about New Spain and Texan independence. When we last talked about the borders of the United States, we have expanded out towards the Oregon Territory, and we obviously have the Louisiana Purchase. We've had that since 1803 and President Jefferson. But our border really ends at Louisiana and what today we would call the Midwest. Next door to us is the country of Mexico. We covered this at the end of Unit 3. Now, at the time period we're going to dive into today, it's not yet Mexico. It is the Spanish colony, New Spain. So when we show some maps later on, you'll notice the area southwest of the United States. That's going to be New Spain, then Mexico, and eventually it'll become part of our nation. We're going to talk about the big part that joins our nation first, Texas. The vocab from this section are Pueblan, Santa Fe Trail, Mission, Vaquero, and Alamo. So, jumping back in time a little bit. Before it's Texas, before it's Mexico, it's Spain. In 1598, the Spanish explorer Juan de Onate, he claims this region for Spain. He comes from Spain to the New World, and he discovers the region that we call Mexico today and the southwestern United States. And the first major city to be found in this region is Santa Fe. Santa Fe is in modern-day New Mexico. It's the capital of New Mexico. And because of its location in the center of not only New Mexico, but just this entire colonial region, it becomes a major trading center. Because if you need to go from west to east, or east to west, or north to south, you have to pass through the middle. And guess what's in the middle? Santa Fe. So because of this, Santa Fe becomes one of the major cities in this colony at the time period. So because of this, we're going to have a lot of people coming into Santa Fe. That being said, one group of Americans who are not allowed to settle in New Spain are Americans, at least not until 1821, when William Becknell becomes the first American to settle in Santa Fe. In 1821, Mexico gains its independence from Spain, and by 1822, William Becknell, the first American, settles in Santa Fe. If you remember from Unit 3, when we talked about explorers, Lewis and Clark, another explorer that came around during this time was Zebulon Pike. Part of the reason why Americans are not allowed in this region is because the Spanish were worried that if we started mapping out this region, we found out about its natural resources, how great of land this was, we might want to take that land for ourselves. And Spain doesn't really want to deal with that. They don't really want us to, potentially steal their land. So they just ban any American settlements up until Mexican independence. Jumping forward a little bit further, we have one main region in New Spain that gets settled pretty heavily, and that's where we're from, California. By 1769, Captain Gaspar de Portola, he leads an expedition up the Pacific coast. You may recognize his last name because of Portola Highway. And in his journey, in his entourage, he has Father Junipero Serra with him. Father Junipero Serra is a Catholic father. Think of him like a priest. He's a religious leader. And one of the goals of this expedition is to establish a number of settlements that will help convert the local people, the American Indians, to Catholicism, the Catholic Church, the Catholic belief system. This is what the Spanish believed in, and they want to spread the religion to this new land, to these new people. So Junipero Serra sets up 21 missions, the southernmost being in San Diego, the northernmost being in San Francisco. And these 21 missions are connected by a road. It's called the Royal Road. You might recognize it as El Camino Royal. It's the center street in San Juan Capistrano, where Mission San Juan Capistrano is. It also makes its way up Highway 1. So if you ever go up the freeway, if you ever drive up to SLO or Santa Barbara, you'll notice that there's these like greenish bells along the side of Highway 1. That's El Camino Royal. This road is established, these missions are established, and like I said, these are self-sufficient communities. They include churches, orchards, gardens, cattle, sheep, everything you need to survive on your own. But the main goal of these missions is not just to be settlements, it's to convert the local people, the American Indians, to Christianity, or in this case, Catholicism. Now, that being said, this might ring a bell. This might be familiar from what you remember learning in 4th or 5th grade elementary history. But you probably got a sugar-coated version of it. Unfortunately, Many of the American Indians that were living at these missions or living in these mission communities, they were not there by choice. They effectively were enslaved by Father Serra and a number of the Spanish missionaries, and they were forced to work on these mission lands. They weren't paid, hence slavery. They were expected to give up everything about themselves, their tribal culture, their belief system, even the way they dressed, even the way they spoke. They were forced to learn Spanish, to become Roman Catholics, to give up their culture, and basically join the Catholic people in the Catholic culture, in Spanish culture. They really weren't given a choice in this. And this is kind of the situation in California for the next couple hundred years. But eventually, as more and more people start to settle in this region, the main way that people are making money and making a living is on ranches. And what is a ranch? Well, it's basically a farm. What kind of farms do we have? What kind of ranches do we have in this region? We have cattle farms. And especially when Mexico gains its independence in the 1820s, 1821 specifically, tons of cattle ranches are going to be founded. So the way it might work is I would get a land grant. So if I were a Mexican citizen and I fought against the Spanish in the Mexican Civil War, or the Mexican War for independence, I might be rewarded with a land grant. I might get a whole bunch of land and I could do whatever I wanted with it. But most people are going to use this land to set up cattle ranches. What is cattle? Cattle is cows. Basically, I'm setting up a cow farm. And these cow farms are going to become the main business in California from the 1820s, literally until today. Mission Viejo was a ranch until it was Rancho Mission Viejo, the Mission Viejo Ranch, up until 1979 when our city was founded. Rancho Santa Margarita, RSM, that was also a ranch as well. And what do people do in these ranches? Well, they raise cows. Why cows? Because cows are a huge deal for the people living at this time. You can do a lot of things with cows. Number one, they are used for meats, right? Like steak, hamburgers, things like that. They're food, they're beef. But also you can use their hides to create leather. What can you use leather for? Well, you can use it for clothing. You can use it for furniture. You can use it for belts, cowboy boots, saddles, a ton of different things. And leather's super great because one, it's very sturdy. It's going to last for a long time. Two, it's weatherproof and waterproof. That's why if your parents have like nice leather seats or a leather couch, it's easier to clean than say cloth or another material. And overall, leather is just going to become very expensive. Something else that cows give us is milk. So there's a lot of different reasons why cattle are going to be so valuable and so important to not only the Spanish people, but later on the Mexican people in this region. And while I might have this giant land grant and this giant cattle herd, I can't exactly take care of them on my own. So I'm going to hire people called vaqueros. If you speak Spanish, you know that vaquero is Spanish for cowboy. Basically, I'm going to hire cowboys. And what do? Well, they're going to take care of the cows, hence the name cowboy. They're going to help manage the herd for many of these rancheros. We'll talk more about cowboys in the future when we get into the Chapter 8 lessons, because they're going to become a massive part of not only Texas culture, but the culture of the entire southwestern part of the United States. So, quick knowledge check. Pause this real quick. Who are the vaqueros? Okay, moving on. So, we've talked about the background so far. What's the deal with New Spain? What's the deal with Mexico? Well, we are now entering the 1820s. And in the 1820s, specifically 1820, Spain realizes that it needs more settlers. It needs more people in Texas. Because if you know anything about Texas, you'll know it's very dry, it's very flat, it's kind of a desert. And at this time period, it's basically the frontier for the Mexicans. It's in the very edge of their colony. It's right at the edge, right where we border with right where they border with the United States, and no one really lives there. So in 1820, Spain decides to invite some Catholic Americans to Spain. Why Catholic? Well, because that's the religion of Spain. They want people who are like them to move to their colony. Like we've talked about, 1821, Mexico gains its independence. So we actually never have American settlers in Spain. We have American settlers in Mexico. Moses Austin is the one given this big land grants, and his son Stephen is the one who brings these 300 Catholic families to this cheap, inexpensive, giant tract of land that we now know as Texas. And this is why, if you have ever been to Texas, you'll know that one of the largest cities is Austin, named after Stephen Austin. So Stephen Austin settles with these families in 1821, and they start doing a couple things. They start building cotton plantations, and they start importing slaves. We'll talk about it much more later, but cotton is one of the most expensive crops you can grow. If you grow cotton and you're able to sell it, you are going to make a whole lot of money. And cotton is super labor intensive. It's very hard to grow cotton. And if you live in the South, how do you run your economy? Well, you run your economy on agriculture. And what makes agriculture easier and cheaper? Slave labor. So we're going to see a lot of cotton plantations entering Texas. We're going to see a lot of slaves entering Texas. This is also prime land for growing cotton. So for a lot of the people at the time period, it made a lot of sense to do this. But as we'll see in a couple slides, Mexico's not going to be super happy about this. And more and more people keep coming to Texas. More and more Americans are in Texas. And by 1830, about 20,000 Americans had settled in this region, in what is Mexico at the time period. So, quick knowledge check number 2. Why were these American settlers eager to move to Texas? Why was this a good deal for them? Okay, moving on. Like I said, Mexico's not going to be super happy with what Texas does. As more and more Americans move to Texas, Mexico realizes, oh, we kind of made a mistake here. We wanted the Roman Catholics to come in. That was fine. But now they're bringing in things we don't like. And the people who are continuing to come to Texas, they're more and more American and less in common, or they have less and less in common with us, the Mexican people. They're not Roman Catholic. They are slaveholders, which slavery is illegal in Mexico at this time period. And more and more Texans are bringing weapons, firearms into Texas. Americans, if remember the Second Amendment, we're a big fan of guns, especially this period. Mexico's not. Spain is not. So the fact that Americans are bringing more and more firearms into the States, they're bringing more and more slaves, which is technically illegal, and more of them are not the religion that Mexico has, or the main religion in Mexico. Because remember, there is no freedom of religion. This isn't America. There is no First Amendment for Mexico. Mexico's not happy about this, so they start cracking down hard. They start banning slavery. Well, they've already banned slavery, but they also, in addition, start banning firearms, or at least certain amounts of firearms, and they start requiring every new settler to become Catholic. Now, if this were the United States, this would be a huge deal, right? Because the First Amendment protects your freedom of religion. You can be whatever religion you want. The government can't change that. But in Mexico, that is not the case. So all these new settlers are being told that all of a sudden they have to become Catholic. Now, I don't know about you, but if I was forced to change religions or become a religion that I don't believe in, I wouldn't be super happy about that. And the same situation is going on here. More and more Americans are moving into Texas, not liking the rules, and starting to think about, hey, maybe we could just join the United States. Texas doesn't have to be Mexican forever. Maybe it can be American now. And this sort of culminates in 1833, when we have a new leader of Mexico. His name is General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. He's going to take control of Mexico, and he's going to become a dictator. And what that means is he's in charge and no one else has a say in government. And by October of 1835, the Texans have had enough. Both the Texans who are Mexican, but also the Texans who have settled from America, are going to band together and start pushing for independence. And they start to come into conflict with Mexico's army. Pause for a quick knowledge check. Why were U.S. settlers opposed to Mexican laws? Why were they unhappy with what the Mexican government was doing? So, Texas is pushing for independence. By March 2nd, 1836, Texas has declared independence, and they have organized under the leadership of Sam Houston. We're talking about cities named after people. There's another big city. Houston, Texas is named after Sam Houston. Sam Houston is the general that leads the Texans to their independence, and eventually he'll also be the first and third president of Texas once it becomes an independent nation. So he leads an army of Texans, meaning Mexicans living in Texas, Americans, meaning Americans who have moved to Texas, and international volunteers. That means people who have come from other nations to help fight on Texas's behalf. Now, realistically, most of the international volunteers were coming from the United States because there's a lot of American pride in Texas because, they are Americans, but also there's a lot of common beliefs, common practices, and familial family ties between the people living in the U.S. and the people living in Texas. So we entered the first large event of this War for Independence. William B. Travis, he's lieutenant colonel. He takes up defensive positions at the Alamo. This is an old Spanish mission in Texas, and they are outnumbered basically 10-1 by the Mexican troops. This is not good. This is not a good situation for the men at the Alamo. There's a number of well-known, famous men defending this place, this mission. People like Jim Bowie, who is the inventor of the Bowie knife. It's a large hunting knife. Men like Davy Crockett, you might have heard that name before. He's got known for his raccoon skin cap. These men are going to be defending the mission. And they're able to defend and hold out and keep the Mexican army outside of the walls for 12 days. But after these 12 days are over, on March 6th, 1836, the walls break and the Mexican soldiers storm the mission. And this is a massacre. Most of the Texans defending the mission die. But as you'll notice, only 180 of them die, where over 1,500 Mexicans are killed in the fighting. Now, while this is technically a defeat for the Texans, this is a huge point of pride for them because it shows their courage, their resilience, the fact that they were able to withstand insurmountable odds. Yes, they didn't win, but they killed way more of the enemy. Just like how in the Battle of New Orleans, only 7 Americans died compared to over 1,000 British. Huge, huge victory for America in the War of 1812. Even though this isn't a victory, in a lot of ways, it really feels like one. So a couple months later, when we get to the final battle of the war, the Alamo is fresh on the minds of the Texan people. This is the Battle of San Jacinto. On April 21st, about 6-ish weeks after the Battle of the Alamo, the Texan rebels caught the Mexican army by surprise. Literally caught them sleeping. When I say sleeping, if you look at the painting in the bottom right, you'll notice that General Santa Anna is hanging out on a blanket. He's laying down. The Texan army literally sneaks up on his army, and they do such a great job of it that they surround the general. While he's sleeping, he ends up waking up to a Texan army surrounding him. And while they're running into battle, while they are springing this surprise attack, they're yelling out, "Remember the Alamo." The Alamo is going to be a huge point of pride for the Texan people going forward. Even up to today, every Texan knows what the Alamo is and knows its significance. So obviously, Santa Anna is caught napping, he's captured, and he's forced to sign a treaty recognizing Texan independence. Because he knows if he won't sign it, the Texans are just going to kill him and keep fighting anyways. So, he kind of takes the L here, signs the treaty. Texas is now independent. Quick knowledge check before we move on. What is the key to the Texans' victory at San Jacinto? Why are they so successful? So, Texas is now independent. It's its own country. And this is why, and this isn't a short-lived thing either. It's not like California where it's only 25 days. It's not like Vermont where it's only a couple months. Texas is its own country for 9 years. And because it's its own country for basically a decade, Texas develops a very independent spirit. They develop the idea that they do things their own way. And this is an independent spirit that has persisted until today. A lot of Texans identify more so with the state they're from than the nation they're from. So if they go to another country, they would say, "Oh, I'm from Texas." They wouldn't say, "I'm American." Whereas most other states would say, "I'm American" over, "I'm California, I'm Nevadan, I'm Utah, I'm Floridian." It's not really something we do. We would say American. Texas is a very different story, partially because of this situation. They're an independent nation for such a long time. And now that Texas is a new country, they're going to kind of push back against the Mexicans still living in this region. If you were a Mexican and you wanted to prove, or you wanted to be a citizen, if you wanted to own property, if you wanted to vote and have, a voice in this new government, you had to prove that you supported the revolution. Now, that's going to be hard to do. It's going to be very difficult for people to prove that they did or didn't support the revolution. And because of this, a number of Mexicans are not going to be able to earn Texan citizenship. They're not going to be able to own property. And many of them are just going to hop the border and go right back to Mexico. So in practice, we end up with a country that's basically America Junior. almost every person in Texas and every citizen in Texas is an American or is the son or daughter, or I guess for citizenship's sake, sons of Americans. It's basically entirely Americans that have moved or born to Americans who had moved to this new nation. But Texas isn't exactly out of the weeds yet. Or out of the woods yet. They have a new nation, sure. They've signed a peace treaty, sure. But Santa Anna signed it under duress. He was basically forced to do it. And by the time that he gets back to Mexico City, the capital of Mexico, he is going to go back on his word. And he is going to claim that Texas is not independent. And they have sort of a border dispute. So if you take a look at the top right, you'll notice that Texas is here in pink and Mexico is here in yellow. And then there's this red line. This red line is the disputed border. This in-between land, in between the pink and the rest of yellow Mexico, Texas claims is hers, and so does Mexico. So Texas claims that the border is on the Rio Grande, where Mexico claims that it's actually way up here near the Nueces River. Keep that in mind. That's going to be an issue going forward. So Texas is a new nation, and they have to deal with the fact that Mexico and them disagree on what the borders are. Mexico doesn't believe that it's an independent country. And to make matters worse, Texas is bankrupt, they're basically out of money, and they're continually threatened by American Indian tribes. Now, that's a pretty difficult situation. And if you're a brand new nation, you might look to someone for help. Who are you going to look to for help? Well, you're going to look to your big brother, America, where most of your people have come from anyways. So they're hoping, hey, let's just join the U.S. That'll solve all of our problems. The U.S. has money. The U.S. has done a good job dealing with American Indians, and the U.S. is stronger than Mexico, so we don't have to worry about our border issue. Sounds great, right? Well, here's the issue. The U.S. is kind of on adding Texas at this time period because for a number of reasons, they don't love the fact that Texas is a slave state because it has slavery. It's got one of those cotton plantations. They don't love that there's a whole border dispute with Mexico. Because remember, this is the 1830s. It's 1836. President Jackson is still president, and he's doing his whole war on the banks. And because he's doing his whole war on the banks, our economy is not in the strongest position it's been in. And he doesn't really want to add Texas because that could provoke Mexico to start a war. And like we've talked about before, when your economy isn't super great, you can't exactly fight a super effective war. So President Jackson decides not to add Texas to our country in 1836. So Texas continues to be its own nation from 1836 until we eventually add them in 1845. So here's what our nation looks like at the time period. You can see all the states in pink. You can see all of our territories up here in brown. Florida, technically still a territory. You can see the Republic of Texas, the disputed border between Mexico and Texas, and then this little bit right here, this is a disputed border between Arkansas and Texas. It's kind of goofy that they dispute a border here, but not really important. The main part is there's a disputed border between Mexico and Texas, and this is what is officially agreed upon as Texas. So, the Republic of Texas lasts for 9 years, like we talked about. And Texas wants to get as many people to move to Texas as possible. So what it does is it does the same thing Mexico did after the revolution. It gives out land grants. Texas is going to give free land to anyone who moves there from America. So of course, tons of Americans are going to move to Texas. To make things even better for them in terms of what it's like moving to a new country, things aren't super great in 1837. If you remember, Andrew Jackson kills the banks. With no central banking system, Martin Van Buren enters office, and the whole economy starts to collapse for all the reasons we talked about earlier this unit. So things aren't super great at home, and Americans are offered a ton of free land in this new place called Texas, which is basically America Junior because it's settled by Americans, using American culture, it's right next door. This seems like a win-win for a lot of Americans. Escape the, bad economy and get a bunch of new land. So a bunch of Americans are going to move to Texas, and by the 1840s, about 140,000 people will live in the country. That means that from 1830, when there was 20,000, we've increased the amount of people living in Texas by 7 times, a 7-fold increase from 20 to 140,000. That's a huge jump in population in only about 10, maybe 15 years. So Texas is starting to do decently well for itself. But at the end of the day, it really wants to join the United States. So by 1845, we get a new president, who we'll talk about in a little bit, and Texas joins the Union in 1845. Quick knowledge check. What are some problems faced by the Republic of Texas?